Peace be upon you, and welcome to the second lesson of the 6 lessons that Robert Kiyosaki learned from Rich Dad. The rich buy assets while the poor and middle class buy liabilities and think they are assets. Follow along with us to understand financial literacy correctly. This is your brother Salah, for me to read a book and explain it to you interestingly. If you're one of those people who don't like reading books or don't have time to read but want to get the benefits of reading without actually reading, then follow us and subscribe to the channel. Let's enjoy the explanation together. After 35 years teaching the 2 children, Robert Kiyosaki and his friend Mike took over the management of his Rich Dad's company, and the company grew and developed better than under his father. As for Robert Kiyosaki, he was around 47 years old at the time. At that time, his wealth was growing and so was his wife's. Whenever anyone asked him how to achieve wealth and make money, he would respond with the same answer as Rich Dad. You need to study financial literacy to build a strong foundation on which to plan your life and future. You need to learn that the rich do not buy liabilities, but the poor and middle class do. Robert Kiyosaki outlined 4 different patterns for managing money. Start explaining each of the 4 patterns. Income is any money that comes to you, whether it's a salary, pension, revenues from a project, a bonus, stock dividends, bonds, or interest. That's income. The second pattern is assets. From the perspective of the poor and middle class, assets are their possessions. Whether it's a house, a car, or real estate, these are considered assets by the poor. However, for the rich, an asset is something that you own that brings in money. If you own something and it doesn't bring in money, then it's not an asset, right? So your house and car that you use in your personal life and don't bring in money, those are not assets. This is from the perspective of the rich, but if you have a house and you rent it out and it brings you money and income, then it is indeed considered an asset. The third pattern we have is expenses, which are any amounts you pay for anything, whether it's food, drink, or transportation costs. These are the expenses. The fourth pattern is liabilities, which are any amounts you are committed to paying, whether it's installments, electricity and water bills, loans, or rent. These are the liabilities. Robert Kiyosaki told you that the poor and the rich deal with these 4 patterns differently. The important difference between them is that the poor and middle class usually have income from salaries, pensions, or donations, and they have monthly expenses like food, drink, clothing, and transportation. So the income goes directly to expenses, bills, electricity, water, debts, and rent, even if a small part of the middle class's income remains. You find them spending on other things like entertainment and luxuries, while the rich have the same expenses and liabilities. However, the important difference between them is that the rich pay for their expenses and liabilities through their assets. They might have a salary like you, but they do not rely on it primarily. Instead, he relies on the income he gets from assets to pay off his liabilities. He has companies, retail stores, stocks, bonds, intellectual properties. All these things bring him money. Through this income, he can cover his expenses and liabilities. However, before paying his liabilities and expenses from his assets, he saves a portion of his income and reinvests it back into assets. The assets continue to grow and expand over time, ensuring that his liabilities and expenses do not affect his income. The strange thing is that the majority of middle-class people focus on buying a nice house to impress their family and friends and having a luxurious, latest model car. This results in an increase in expenses and liabilities. Instead of buying assets that generate income, they buy liabilities that drain their money, bringing them back to square one, waiting for their salary to cover their obligations and expenses. And if he had learned financial literacy well, he would have been able to buy an asset that generates income for him, and from that income, he could buy the house and car he needs. The asset would continue to work and generate money for him. Robert Kiyosaki told a very beautiful story with his wife. He said one day he made a very good deal and earned a large amount of money, and he thought of gifting his wife a car. A latest model Mercedes, and its price was certainly high. It's a Mercedes car anyway. He told me he remembered what his rich dad said. The poor and middle class buy liabilities. They buy liabilities that take money out of their pockets, while the rich buy assets that bring money in. So I thought instead of buying a car that would take a large amount of money from me all at once, I would buy an asset. From its profits, I would buy my wife the car as a gift, and at the same time, my project would be running and bringing in money. They say after 4 years, I was able to gather the money for the car from the profits of the project I started, bought her the car, and the asset is still generating money for me. It was the asset that got my wife a car, not what I brought or paid out of pocket. If I had bought the car 4 years ago, this project wouldn't have existed, and I would have paid a lot for gas bills, repairs, maintenance, and insurance over the 4 years. And this is the mindset of the rich, my friend. You don't need to have millions to be rich. If your income from your assets exceeds your liabilities or covers them, and you can grow and expand your assets even a little with what remains, then you are a rich person. As long as your income covers your liabilities and you have some left over, you are a rich person. Let me give you an example of a person I know personally. This man worked in Saudi Arabia for about 20 years. After covering his expenses and annual commitments, he managed to save 2 million Saudi riyals over 20 years. This was all from his own business. He wasn't an employee. He had a project that generated money for him while he stayed in one place. But one day, he left Saudi Arabia and returned to Egypt to join his family. He left his project, bought land, and built a house for himself and his family. This house drained his 20-year savings, and he spent only 1 year in it with his family until he ran out of money. So he decided to go back to Saudi Arabia again. But when he went back to rent a car to work just to cover his household expenses and obligations, what would you think if I told you that this is the case for most people in our country? They have money that they could invest and double within a year, yet they go and pile it into a house or the latest model car. And he goes back to looking for scraps to cover his expenses, and that's the real poor person. Imagine with me that he could save no less than 8,000 riyals monthly, which is more than enough after his expenses. Imagine if he had invested it in an asset that generates monthly income. What would his situation be after 20 years? The rich acquire assets, while the poor and middle class acquire liabilities and think they are assets. If you remember when I told you in the intro, wealth is a mindset and poverty is a mindset, for any human mind, the poor think the house they live in is one of their assets. However, the rich will tell you an asset is something that brings in money, not something that takes money away. So we really need to learn financial literacy in schools. Next, we will understand liabilities and expenses should be the last things we buy with our money. Then our asset column will be large, and we will be able to pay off our liabilities, debts, and bills from it. And assets will continue to grow constantly. It's not important how much money you make, but rather how much money you can keep, grow, and turn into assets. The poor and middle class have expenses and liabilities, and the rich also have the same expenses and liabilities. However, the primary difference between them is that the poor often have income only from their salary, and 90% of that income goes towards expenses and liabilities. The rich save part of their income and reinvest in assets, while the rest is used for expenses. Eventually, the assets grow and pay off their debts and liabilities. To sum up, if you want to become wealthy, you need to find ways to increase your income. If you are an employee, try to save part of your income and invest it to create extra income. If your salary just covers your liabilities and expenses, you need to make your money work. You need to think of other ways to increase his income. You will find them if you just use your mind. I hope I have been helpful. If you liked what we discussed today, we would be honored if you subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to give us a like if you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for the next lesson. Peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessings.